Hello everyone, my name is Alexandra-Gabriela Baranyi. I'm a first-year doctoral student at the Bucharest University of Economic Studies in Romania. The paper I will present today is entitled The Impact of European Nihilism over the Contemporary Japanese Society. Just to present a little bit of my background, I'm currently teaching Japanese language at the Romanian American University in Bucharest, and I'm also working as a Japan travel expert at an agency in Romania. Last year, during a scholarship to the Ritsumeikan University in Osaka, Japan, I also worked as a research assistant with Professor Dr. Olivia Kennedy. So those are the reasons why I chose to speak about the contemporary Japanese society today. As an introduction of my research, we first have to make the difference between the two perspectives over the nothingness as a concept. On the one side, we have the continental philosophy, in which nothingness is associated with nihilism, which was developed during the 19th century, and refers to the absence of meaning. On the other side, we have the Japanese philosophy, in which nothingness is a Zen Buddhism thought, also referred as emptiness, and it means that every object exists only in relation to one another. The issue the following research is stating is that nowadays both the European and the Japanese societies are driven by a nihilistic wave in which the rapid changes in technology, religion beliefs, or science are shrinking the firm ground based on the values that were previously meaningful for the individuals. And the actual problem is to see how was it possible for the European nihilism to have such a great impact on a very conservatory society deep embedded in its traditional values, as Japan. So my paper is based on a non-empirical research following three steps. First one is nothingness in the continental versus the Japanese philosophy. It's actually a comparative analysis between the main ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche and Keiji Nishitani to see how exactly was nihilism perceived as a theory in Japan. The second one is the blind absorption of European nihilism in Japan based on a critical analysis over the dialogues between Carl Lewis and Keiji Nishitani to see when exactly and how was nihilism absorbed by the Japanese society. And the third step is the loss of traditional values in the contemporary Japanese society. It's a comparison between the pattern met in the past changes with the current social dilemmas in Japan and how are they related with nihilism. I started with two hypotheses. The first one is that the European nihilism was blindly absorbed because of the exposure to Western influence during the 20th century, and the pattern is repeating in the current era as well. The second one is that the present social problems, such as growing trend of suicidal rate or reluctance to Western values in the recent years, are the result of the current nihilistic wave. So the first step of my research is nothingness in the continental versus the Japanese philosophy. We first have Nietzsche in the European context, where nihilism appeared at the stage where previous religious beliefs were denied by atheism. And so Nietzsche says that God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. He doesn't say that a God didn't exist, but we ourselves denied his meaning. So in a general sense, nihilism in Europe states that it's a state where everything that was previously based on faith collapses and the person is left with no answers to the question why. Nietzsche suggests that the solution here is to create a new ground from the point zero based on science and development. In the Japanese philosophy, we have Nishitani, who had studied Nietzsche's theories very closely, and in his philosophy, he analyzes the existential nihilism in connection with the Zen Buddhist nothingness. He is suggesting that nihilism is something very natural, which every individual may encounter in his life when passing from the field of consciousness, where he is too concerned about the everyday life, to the field of nihility, where he is left with the great doubt, where at the same as Nietzsche, he is saying that in this context he cannot find any answers to the question why. He is left with no meaning of life. But the next step in Nishitani's view is the field of emptiness, where even nothingness itself becomes empty. So every individual, every object gets a meaning from being in connection with everything else that exists at the same time, at the same place. So the second stage of my research is the blind absorption of European nihilism, which has had two waves. The first one during the Meiji period, which began at the end of the 19th century, after the almost 300 years of Sakoku, which means border closing. Japan needed or was kind of forced to open itself to the European influence in order to develop itself. And so they imported new technologies, new religious beliefs and political directions, which in some cases were opposed to the traditional ones. For example, the feudal military government, the shogunates, were replaced with emperorship. So they needed to fast learn and integrate all the information with no time to filter it. And the second wave was the first decades after the World War II, where the Japanese power and influence was put to questions by their own population, and the general trust was lost. So the process of westernization was also enforced by the American occupation. So we can see a common pattern where all the values that were before forming the firm ground had shrunk, and they had no time to re-establish a new set of values from what was coming from the West. This controversial aspect gave born to some dialogues between European thinkers and Japanese philosophers. For example, Carl Lowitt says that Japan came to know us only after it was too late, after we ourselves lost faith in our civilization, and the best we had to offer was a self-critique, of which Japan took no notice. In other words, he is criticizing the fact that the Japanese never critically analyzed their own tradition. He also states that the Japanese live in a two-story house without a ladder. The first level where they think in a Japanese traditional way, and the second level where all the European thoughts are aligned. So because they lack in this self-critique, they did not manage to create a fusion between the two perspectives, the Japanese and the Western. In response, Nishitani says that the tradition must be rediscovered from the ultimate point where it is grasped in advance as the end of our westernization and of the Western civilization itself. So what he is stating is that they don't necessarily need to create a fusion between those two ways of thinking, but actually rediscover their own tradition that was lost during the exposure to Western influence. So this is the third stage of my research, the hypothesis that there is a third wave of nihilism going on the contemporary Japanese society. So I analyzed the suicidal rate from the year 2000 to 2018, which was decreasing in the last years, but it remains kind of high. It's nowadays 18% to 100,000 population. And also the birth rate, which is decreasing, and the extreme right-wing group attacks from the beginning of 21st century, all those are signs that there is a third wave of nihilism going on the Japanese society, which may be related to the fact that they follow a path where work becomes more important and they evaluate work more than family or values that were before meaningful for the Japanese society. And so from a subconscious attempt to reestablish a firm ground based on the Japanese traditional values, there can be observed depreciation of ideas or values that are coming from the West in the last decades. So the result of my research, the first hypothesis that the European nihilism was blindly absorbed by the exposure to Western influence during the 20th century, and that the pattern is repeating in the current era, proved to be true because the fact that there is no solid ground of values will constantly generate nihilistic waves, as it is happening in the contemporary Japanese society. And the second hypothesis, that the present social problems, such as suicidal rate or reluctance to Western values in the recent year, are the result of a current nihilistic wave, also proved to be true because there was an attempt to build a new set of values which proved to be unsuccessful. And so it generated reticence to Western ideas. So some proposals for combating the nihilistic waves are, for example, to go back to the roots with a critical perspective, as Carl Lewis has said. Secondly, to analyze the Western influence effects on the last century. And the third solution proposed was to create a new strategy in approaching the West, filtering the information and adapting it to the Japanese society. In conclusion, the fact that Japan opened its border to Western culture in a period of time where Europe was also dealing with a nihilistic stage made them blindly absorb the nihilism as well in their culture. And the later discussions between Carl Lewis and the Japanese philosophers showed that Japan do not have a critical analysis know-how over their own traditional beliefs. And so the rapid changes in the current societies are a hurdle in the process of re-establishing a new set of values and beliefs to form a new firm ground. Here are the references I used in my research. So thank you very much for your attention.